10 o'clock Friday night, hundreds of white nationalists storming the University of Virginia, protesting plans to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The overnight violence spilling into this morning when marchgoers and counter-protesters clash again, hours before the Unite to Right march was even set to begin. Just after 10:30 a.m., the crowd growing in size. Local and state police in riot gear responding in force, but the violence escalating. Just before noon, Virginia's governor declaring a state of emergency. Just before 2 p.m., the situation taking that deadly turn.
You can see the silver 2010 Dodge Challenger barreling down the hill toward a sea of targets with little time to react, slamming to a stop only after it hit a van and another car. Locked in, that car shifting in reverse, screeching back down the street to get away. One person, a 32-year-old woman, left dead. 19 more rushed to the hospital, 5 in critical condition. The suspected driver, 20-year-old James Alex Fields Jr., is behind bars.
History is being made in Memphis tonight. Within the next few hours, both the Nathan Bedford Forrest and Jefferson Davis statues will no longer stand in our city. The Forrest statue was placed in 1904 as Jim Crow segregation laws were being enacted. The Davis statue was placed in 1964 as the civil rights movement was changing this country. These statues no longer represent who we are as a modern, diverse city with momentum.
It had stood at the University of North Carolina for 105 years. Tonight, the Confederate statue known as Silent Sam is toppled.
I am happy that it is gone. I am so glad, it had no place being on here in the first place.
University officials had acknowledged the statue was divisive, but said state law prevented them from removing it. Today, UNC's board took a hard line against the protesters, calling their actions unacceptable, dangerous, and incomprehensible. Adding mob rule and the intentional destruction of public property will not be tolerated. What did the statue signify for you?
For me, it was hatred. For me, it was inferiority and inequality.
There are more than 1,700 publicly supported Confederate symbols across the country. More than 100 have been removed since 2015, when an avowed white supremacist massacred black churchgoers in South Carolina. The national outcry intensified last year after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia left one person dead.
I think it's a disgrace as part of North Carolina history.
With violence against police officers on the rise, a growing number of states are passing so-called Blue Lives Matter laws. Texas is on the verge of joining Louisiana and Kentucky as a third state to classify violence against officers as a hate crime. Similar legislation is also pending in more than a dozen other states. Tony DeCopel looked into this.
When a sniper opened fire in Dallas last July, Heidi Smith's husband, Michael, was one of 5 officers killed.
Just because he wore the uniform, he still came home to us every night.
Now Smith is afraid more police will be targeted. 135 officers were killed on duty in 2016, the highest total in 5 years. Of those, 21 officers were ambushed, the highest total in more than 2 decades.
Structure fire for Light 464. We're taking some pretty heavy flak on Adams about Hobart. There's 3 separate structure fires through the window. Like the full hard. There's a PD in that area and some fire companies assigned. We have a fireman shot. We have a fireman shot. We need help immediately. Roger, OCD. We can't beat us out in the room of the gurney.
They're dispatching LAPD units along with all fire trucks that respond to major emergency blazes for protection. But with respect to trying to get LAPD service or anything else, folks, you're on your own down there.
There are fires burning, there are people being beaten, there is looting. It is a dangerous night in the city of Los Angeles.
I'm advised that there is someone from the Secretary of State's office on the way over to accept this proclamation of a state of emergency for Los Angeles City and Los Angeles County. This is in response to a request by Mayor Bradley. As a result of the discussions that we have had, there will be as many as 750 California Highway Patrolmen. Additionally, we have made available some 2,000 National Guardsmen. They are on standby, prepared to move. Transport has been arranged, and it is our purpose here at the state government level to restore law and order and to minimize the danger to the residents of the area. This is a matter that needs to be settled in the courts and not in the streets. Thank you.
People, I just want to say, you know, can we all get along? Can we get along?
That, of course, was Rodney King appealing for calm as the Los Angeles riots raged in the spring of 1992. Violence swept the city 25 years ago today after 4 white police officers accused of beating King were acquitted.
More than 50 people were killed and more than $1 billion worth of property was damaged or destroyed.
Get off the street, drive away. You'll be subject to arrest.
The predominantly black South Central part of Los Angeles was neglected, plagued with unemployment, poverty, and suffering through the crack epidemic.
It began with police and rioters clashing on a hot Wednesday night. Some believe it could have been stopped right then if law officers moved in force and sealed off the area. Perhaps so, perhaps not. But within a matter of hours, it was completely out of hand. More than 1,500 people were in the streets, many hurling rocks and bottles at the police or anyone else, some attacking the cars of people. 15 citizens injured, 19 officers hurt, none seriously, 31 arrested, 12 juveniles. More than 100 police rushed to the area, sealing off 8 square blocks in an effort at quarantine. The rioting subsided, then began all over again shortly before dawn. KNXT's camera car was hit by rock throwers early in the battle, then later tipped over by a mob of young men and set afire.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Two beer cans, a Coca-Cola bottle, green plastic bottle, badly burned wristwatch stopped at 12:45, a set of keys. No bodies.
I want the entire area searched, every inch.
Yes, sir. It's a big swamp.
Every inch, Mr. Byrd. I guess they never left Mississippi.
Yeah, they're dead. They're dead.
Mr. Byrd?
Yes, sir.
There's a telephone back at the truck stop. Get to it, get on it, and get me 100 more men here by morning.
100?
100.
What, Bureau people, sir?
I don't care if it's... Damn Army. I want this entire swamp searched.
Yes, sir.
Don't do it, Mr. Ward. Let's start a war.
It was a war long before we got here.
African Americans since the end of slavery have been treated in much of the country as a despised minority. They are forced to eat and use bathrooms separately from whites. James Farmer is the founder of the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE.
In order to understand how any Negro feels under segregation, you have to realize that from the time of infancy, he has it pounded into him that he's not as good as other people. There are things he cannot do. Don't do this, you can't do this, you can't do the other. It builds into a man a feeling of inferiority, a feeling of frustration, a feeling of resentment.
James Farmer and CORE want Kennedy to understand that segregation stains America's image around the world. CORE wants to test the Supreme Court ruling, long ignored in the South, that bans segregation in interstate travel. The plan is for black and white volunteers to ride together on buses. Journeys that CORE calls Freedom Rides. On May 4th, 1961, James Farmer leads 13 people, black and white, onto buses in Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans. Ten days later, the bus enters Alabama, home to the largest KKK organization in America. They know the riders are coming. In Anniston, the Klan surrounds the bus, slashing its tires. Photographer Joe Postiglione captures these images. The crippled Greyhound tries to escape, but a few miles out of town, the Klan surrounds and firebombs it, with the riders still inside.
Released in 1915, D.W. Griffith's A Birth of a Nation is one of the most important films in cinema history, and is considered to be the birth of the American film industry. It's hard to overstate the impact that this film had both on the medium of film itself and on culture as a whole. The film was responsible for some major leaps in film technology, including the first scene shot at night by use of phosphorus lamp, along with new developments in editing technique and camera movement. But culturally, however, the film carries somewhat of a darker legacy. Even in 1915, the film was met with controversy. Showing of the films were protested by the newly formed National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People for its portrayal of black people. Executive Secretary of the NAACP, Mary Childs Nerney, wrote, "The harm that it is doing to coloured people cannot be estimated. I hear echoes of it everywhere I go, and I have no doubt that this was in the mind of the people who are producing it." The film's portrayal of black people was so terrible that it was still being used as a recruitment tool for the Ku Klux Klan as late as the 1970s. The film is split into two halves, separated by an intermission. The first half is set at the outbreak of the Civil War. The second half of the film focuses on the reconstruction of the South after the war, and the glorious origin of the film's supposed heroes, the Ku Klux Klan. The film shows South Carolina just after the war being occupied by black Union soldiers who push white people off sidewalks and are sexually aggressive towards white women. In one scene, a young white girl jumps to her death to avoid being pursued by a black man who is looking to force her into marriage. Black supremacists rig an election by intimidating white voters and stuffing ballot boxes, and the newly elected black legislators are depicted barefoot in the State House of Representatives, drinking whiskey and eating fried chicken. Meanwhile, our hero, Ben Cameron, sees a group of white children putting on sheets to pretend to be ghosts in order to scare black children, and is inspired to form the Klan to fight back. By the end of the film, the Klan regain control of their town from the black oppressors, and on the next election day, they form a line to intimidate black voters and finally restore power. Despite the film's overall message of overt racism, it was still incredibly popular. It remained the highest grossing movie of all time until it was replaced by Gone with the Wind in 1939. It was even the first film to be shown in the White House to President Woodrow Wilson.
Pick that gun. Move along now. Come on, Ellis. Drive them niggas. Pick that gun. Move along now. Here, what you doing, boy? Come on.
Sun gon' set here. Sun down the mountain. Sun gon' set here. Sun down the mountain. Sun gon' set here. Sun down the mountain.
I've spent much of my life searching for the stories of the African American people. I've always wanted to tell their history. 5 centuries in the making. It's a living history. And I've traveled around the country and across the globe to chronicle it.
Assalamu alaikum. Did any of you receive wealth inherited from the slave trade?
The African American story begins here on the Atlantic Ocean. Africans crossed these waters with the very first European explorers. And their stories show that right from the start, the black people who came to this land nurtured aspirations and dreams. Dreams that would never disappear, even in the long night of slavery. Dreams that would help them endure and overcome. Florida, the first known African in America, came here with Spanish explorers in 1513. His name was Juan Garrido. He was free, and he left his mark on the New World. Garrido helped Cortez take Mexico. Then he headed for California, searching for gold. "20 years later, a black man struggled to cross this Texas desert. He was called Esteban the Moor. He was one of just 4 survivors of a Spanish expedition that went horribly wrong. Esteban served as a guide and a translator for his companions, negotiating their way to safety across this forbidding landscape. By the year 1536, they had walked 15,000 miles. They had seen more of the North American continent than any explorers would until Lewis and Clark. Garrido and Esteban were among the first Africans in our country. They found hope and opportunity here. But things changed quickly. Jamestown, Virginia, the first British colony in what became the United States. In 1619, this was the ultimate frontier town. Crude fortifications bordering a muddy, malarial swamp. Then one morning in August, a ship appeared. It was carrying African slaves, part of a small group that had just landed at Port Comfort, a few miles from here. That's how slavery began in the English colonies. Plantations, as we imagine them, didn't exist yet. This was just a fragile outpost in the wilderness.